All right. Dr. Daly, welcome to the Supported Learning Podcast. How are you, sir?
Good, Joe. How are you tonight?
I am doing well. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
just yeah, no, I appreciate it. Just a little background for our audience. Dr. Daly is a professor from the University of Memphis in European history, and he is also an AP World History reader for the exam, meaning he actually reads and scores the LEQ portion of the AP World exams. And how long have you been doing that for?
It's almost over 7 years now. Well, I mean, I guess if you add it all up, it's more like 12 because I did it when I was graduate school, took a few years off, and came back to it about 7 years ago. So, and this year's kind of exciting. I'm going to be a table leader, which means I'm one of the people who reads the answers and comes up with the rubrics.
So is the chief score, is that going to be like some of that input, is that going to be from you?
Yeah, I think so. My understanding is like the table leaders are you get there early, you read the answers, and then you help kind of come up with you help the scorers kind of come up with the baseline rubrics for the tests.
Awesome. Okay,
So
cool.
that's
We'll
going to be
dive
a good
into
one for
that.
me this year.
Yeah. Um, well, so I mean, yeah, I guess let's just start for the audience that, that don't know you. That was that a good enough intro, or am I missing any accolades?
Nope, I'm not missing any accolades. I mean,
Okay.
I could plug my book that's coming out in a couple months, but I
Plug your
won't.
book. We'll plug your book. Yeah, it's a podcast. Plug your book. What do you got coming out?
With a collaborator of mine from University of Georgia, we're publishing a critical edition and translation of a Caribbean play from the 1970s. So it'll be coming out of
Awesome.
Liverpool University Press in May, I think. So
Is it Hamilton the Caribbean version, or no? Is that it's not the
no,
remix of
no, definitely not Hamilton.
Gotcha. So
There
you
is
spent
music though, and there's the anyway. So
really
yeah,
gonna get a Broadway deal. Call
yeah, maybe we'll
Lin
work.
Manuel. There you go. So I guess let's just take us back to like what was the initial interest in history? Like what gravitated you towards trying
Sure, I
to
mean
become a
that is a
history
really
professor?
good question. Like, why would someone become a professional historian? I think it was a couple fold. It was always a subject I was really good at in school, and was always interested in. But I would really think I would say it was my grandparents. So my mother's parents. My grandfather was from the United States. He was born and raised outside Cincinnati, and he kind of experienced sort of the full gamut of what we might call American history in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Right. So he had to live through the Depression. He had to while he was in high school, he had to work a job to help support his family, and then he was drafted during the war, fought in Europe. That's where he met my grandmother, who was from Birmingham in England, and so I think their story was so tied up in the history of the middle part of the 20th century that I was just always fascinated by that. And, he used to tell me stories like he himself was a great, um, storyteller, right, and a recounter of the past, and so that I think kind of got me on that path.
That's so cool. That's so your grandparents got you. That was kind of like my journey too, because the
Yeah.
I so my grandfather, I'll say, fought in World War II, although he was 17 at the time, and he brags about being smart enough in the Navy to test into signalman, which was like a very important position. So he worked the flags, the signals on the ship that like the landing craft would move in and out of repair. So he was that role. He was in the 1944. He was 17. He was in the Pacific. But my actually love for history didn't start because of stories from him, which I knew very little of. But he used to have an awesome VHS collection of just World War II movies and westerns. So
Right.
the first one, because I love trains, I love planes growing up. Von
Mm-hmm.
Ryan's Express with Frank
Yep. Yep.
Sinatra, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of triggered it. And then there was The Great Escape and all these classic 1970 World War II movies. And then fast forward to like the modern version of World War movies, like, oh, that war was nothing like that. Like it was much more horrible. But yeah. So I guess why did you why'd you gravitate towards European history of all things though?
I mean, that is a really good question. When I went, I think actually, and this maybe will speak a little bit to some other things I might mention. Is it was a professor in college. It I had a professor in college. His name is he's retiring this year actually. Dr. Ben Westervelt, and he was actually a medieval historian, and he was like one of those historians out of central casting, right? He was just like a great, like compelling, interesting lecturer. He knew multiple languages. He could, translate passages out of Latin like in his head, and it was just, I was starstruck, right? So, um, yeah, I think he pulled me into it. I mean, I'd always been interested in history. I thought about majoring in history in college, but I didn't know that I was going to become a professional historian probably until I met him and basically wanted to be him. And that pulled me into European history. I gravitated out of the early period into like, the later period, but that's definitely why I decided to study European history. That and I was you know, I wouldn't say fluent, but very good at French already. So I kind of already had that in my belt.
Okay. Oh, you're fluent in French. That's
I'm not
awesome.
fluent. I wouldn't say I'm fluent, but yeah, I have a good knowledge of French. So.
Okay. Cool. Yes, like I was I went into teaching, but I had some really awesome history professors that kind of
Mm-hmm.
like I was gonna go for pre-law and then I switched. But I was lucky enough that the dean of the department
Mm-hmm.
retired. He actually taught my favorite history teacher in high school. And
Uh-huh.
and he was like an expert in Nazism and the Holocaust. So
Mm-hmm.
it was just he was great. He was also central, wore three-piece suits, had the pocket watch, half British. It was pretty cool. Yeah, no, for sure. So you're an associate professor?
Yes, I'm an associate professor.
Okay. And I guess like how did you end up in Memphis? How did that role
Right.
evolve?
That's a great
Right.
question. So I'm actually originally, as I tell my students, and many of them are from California. I'm originally from California. I grew up in
I
San
didn't know
Francisco.
that.
Yeah, I grew up in
Okay.
San Francisco, and we did move to Oregon when I was seven. Sorry, we moved to Washington State when I was 17. I went to college in Oregon. I've been all over, but when I was looking for graduate schools, I got pointed in the direction of this woman who was teaching, who teaches. She's retired now too, but taught at Rutgers in New Jersey, and so that's where I did my doctorate. And I came to Memphis. They offered me a job. I didn't.
That's pretty nice.
I finished my dissertation at a really kind of inopportune moment for the job market, as they call it in my profession, in 2011. Right, so it was after the crash, and in retrospect, it actually wasn't that bad. It's even worse now. But they offered me
Also,
a job. I came down here. I've been here. I just realized I've been here 14 years now. So.
yeah, I mean to get in at that point because around that time I was looking to go back for my master's and it was either going to be
Mm-hmm.
in teaching education or in history. And my my the Dr. Dunn, who I loved, he was like, if you were my son, I would say go into get a master's in education teaching because there's not going to be a lot of jobs. Like it's just a declining field. It's kind of sad.
It is.
Um,
My
but
friend calls us the lifeboat generation, and that like the ship went down, but we managed to get to the lifeboats. But we had a lot of friends who drowned, right? Like it was,
that's a horrible
it was
analogy. That's terrible.
it's a terrible analogy,
Love
but
it.
he's right. It's like
That's
we
not, yeah.
know people from graduate school or friends of ours who were never able to find
Yeah.
a
I mean,
job, and it's just gotten worse since. So, but
yeah, I know
that's a whole nother
my,
conversation, I'm afraid.
yeah. Well, we can kind of get into that.
Yeah.
I guess, is that too much feedback if I put that fan on just because it's a little hot? But, so you teach undergraduates, you research decolonization.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, I know you're a professor, but you've always been working with kids in AP prep as
Mm-hmm.
well. What is like one part of education that whether it's K-12, higher ed, whatever, that I guess you wish we would rethink or redesign when it comes to teaching decolonization or colonization in general, because it's like colonization bad, decolonization good, and
Mm-hmm.
it's still, I think, taught through like a lens of black and white.
Mm-hmm.
But what is your opinion about that?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think one of the things is that the way we teach it often has to be. I mean, it's inevitable when you teach anything, is you've got to sort of. It's hard to get into the nuances of things when you're trying to teach. a huge amount of history in a small amount of time, right? Like most of the time we teach decolonization, it's being taught in the context of these large survey courses, right? So you get maybe
Mm,
1 day or 2 days out of a semester to actually talk about it, right? So you
right.
can't get into the nuances of it. But yeah, I mean, I think if you drill down and you look, like colonialism is extremely complicated because it was always about, it's this the story I tell my students about India, right? Is that at the height of the British Raj, right, in the 1930s, there were only something like 100,000 British people in India ruling over 250 million Indians, right? So at some point, there had to be some degree of buy-in, right, from the population,
Mm.
right? And so, part of the interesting story about decolonization is why does that buy-in disappear? Like, why do people change their minds? Or why do people decide that, in some cases it's more obvious, right? Like the colonial regime is more cruel, right? But in other cases, it becomes the question of like, well, why do they decide that they don't want to be part of this empire anymore? Like, what switches? Why is it that all of a sudden, they're not interested in that kind of approach anymore? I mean, in that kind of existence anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, well, if you're saying like, you asked me a question earlier about like how I'd redesign things and what I see as sort of some of the faults. I think that's where like, you know, schools have moved away from, I don't know about at the high school level, although I get this impression as well, but particularly at the college level, we've moved away from this idea of learning from a bunch of different types of disciplines, right? Um, Back in the 70s and 80s, that was all the premium, right? But now, you know, people who take history don't also take classes in literature, political science, or philosophy or languages, right? And so you're not learning all the different aspects of something that history can teach a lot. That's one of the reasons I like history, right? Everything's got a
Mm.
history, right? But it helps to sometimes have those different skill sets from different sort of disciplines.
I mean, so do you teach the intro level courses as well to some students?
Yeah, so I teach. Actually, I mean that's one of the reasons I sought you out, right? Is I teach the intro to world history, right? And I think
Okay.
part of what I like about tutoring, what I like about what we do here is that I've been dissatisfied with the level of preparation among a lot of my students, right? And I think being able to it's been really helpful for me to see like what actually is taught in the AP curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you it's a lot different than when I took the AP test back in the
Yeah,
'90s, and
me
it's a
too.
lot better.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
Yeah.
lot better. The skill sets that are being taught in the AP history courses are really excellent in terms of preparing students for college. And so for me, I feel like
If they're taught though,
if they're
if they're
taught,
taught,
right?
yes.
So
What
like,
they require is good.
I no probably not a single one of the students I work with is ever going to come to the University of Memphis and learn from me, but I do
Right.
feel like I'm kind of paying it forward in the sense that like they're going to end up in someone's history class at some point, like in college, hopefully not introductory because they got a 4 or 5 on the test, right? But
Yeah. Right. Right.
end up maybe in an advanced history class and they're going to have a set of skills that their teacher is really going to appreciate that they have when they get into that classroom.
Mm.
Right? And so I kind of that's what I've enjoyed about it. So
That's awesome. I do enjoy that too. I guess. Oh, are you in the American Historical Association?
I am and I'm not.
Or not
I,
paying your membership or
I,
whatever?
I let my membership lapse about 2 years
Yeah,
ago
I
because I
gotcha.
hadn't been to a conference in a while. I should really probably sign up again, but yeah, I let my membership lapse.
So I was invited. Actually, my next guest after you, I'm speaking, Craig Perrier. He's gonna be on the podcast here soon. Um, we did a three speaker panel like
Mm-hmm.
presentation. It was with another professor from Pitt.
Mm-hmm.
About she talked about history and scale and identifying scale,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Craig talked about like how to teach from the lens of a rounded like global citizen.
Right.
Excuse me. And I presented on basically, and this was a K-16 presentation, so it was meant to be for teachers and for professors, and just I was so impressed by the IB curriculum because the IB curriculum
Right.
is all writing and those
Mm-hmm.
assessments and it really just takes any type of even if you teach it pure, you're avoiding putting any type of bias in the way you teach it because of your exploration of historiography and how you have to look at all sources. So I like that because it's like, oh, during the Cold War, America did some bad things. Russia was like, yeah, but like everyone gets the context, which is a lost skill, right? Contextualization is such a lost skill now because we're during the last couple of years, we're tearing down statues of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and George Washington in the same lens that we're tearing down statues of Confederate generals.
Mm-hmm.
But what I thought was what IB is centered around is the assessments of writing and allowing the students to develop the argument. And I've seen AP history, a lot of the APs move towards more argument-based writing. But as teachers, as history teachers, as history educators, I mean, I love my college I went to, but I think in terms of preparation and especially preparing to teach kids writing, we're not writing teachers, right? We don't come out with that skill. We usually become history teachers because we love history. We either loved our teachers or loved our professors, and we love talking about history, but we're not really gifted with the skills or taught the skills of how to actually teach those fundamental things. Have you seen that matriculate up? Have you seen a decline of kids writing, of thought over the last X
Yeah.
amount of years?
I mean, it's so complicated because I think it goes back, as you said, it's a case through 16 issue, right? Like, it's about how we structure our educational system, what we put priorities on at lower levels. And then, if you're thinking about, the ideal of an education is you're building, 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 right? You're building a platform, and adding the more complicated things as you go. But, the shift towards like test-based learning, has damaged the ability of people to read and write. And, I would say if you ask any college professor, they would tell you that this is a huge problem, right? And there's, of course, other issues beyond that, right? I mean, about, social media, attention spans, things like that. I do think, yeah, we're not, it's an old joke about PhD, right? It's like you get a PhD and you're going to leave and you're going to spend half your time teaching and you spend maybe like 1% of your PhD career learning how to teach, right? Like, so, yeah, it's a bit of a problem. I think I'm actually, again, I think what I'm impressed about with the AP exam, having now like sat with it for a couple of years, and is the way in which it's actually now moved towards teaching a skill set more than like just content. Like now there's content still important. Don't get me wrong.
You're right.
Like,
Foundational.
but like the kind of questions they ask you on the test these days about like, you know, just basic things about like, can you understand a historical argument? Do you understand that history is a set of interpretations, right? Like,
Right.
we don't have time machines. We can't go to the past and see what actually happened. Like, we're using these traces that we have to tell a story. And so people can interpret the same document different ways. And so I think it's really interesting to me that they've moved in that direction. And I think it shows they've really thought through about what they're doing. So, and I think it's one of the real benefits, I think, for students now of taking AP, right? Is because they're getting a real leg up on their fellows who are not taking that kind of class, because those are the skills you're going to need in college. Whether you major in history, you major in something else, like that set of skills is something that's going to be extraordinarily useful for you across whatever it is you plan to do as a college student, whatever you plan to do, in the rest of your life. So,
Well, and that's why I think we don't share that enough with our parents about, unless you're doing AP seminar and AP research,
mm-hmm.
AP literature, AP language is not really set up to teach you how to write argumentative based essays, but history does. And so when you're in college, you're writing a lot of research papers. If you don't get that skill from somewhere, you're going in underprepared 100%. And then kids are probably getting crushed, I assume, on how they do it. But let's talk about AI,
Yeah,
because
I
it
mean, this segues immediately into AI, I think. So,
yeah, I think because like, all right, so ChatGPT is what, like maybe a year old, maybe, at
yeah,
least
I
in
think
terms of
it's,
like being maybe two. I'm not sure.
yeah,
Maybe
in terms of
2 years.
ubiquity, I'd say 2 years old, right? Maybe a
Okay.
year and a half.
Yeah. So it was so funny because like in my high school, we were like, teachers were talking about it. There was one teacher, computer science teacher, was like warning us, "Hey, AI is coming." Like it's, and
Hmm.
then it was like within its instant, it was here, and kids were cheating with it already. So like, you obviously are in humanities. How do you see this as a shift in the way kids are engaging, students are engaging with historical thinking, research in the coming years? Because
Yeah.
is there going to be a need for research if we have AI? Like, what is how disruptive will this be to this profession?
I mean, it's interesting. So, we've had a lot of conversations with my colleagues about this. I've had a conversation with a friend of mine who he's not an AI researcher, but he's a tech guy. Like he thinks about this stuff a lot. And I think part of it is, what AI or what the models of AI that we actually have right now and what they do has maybe been overhyped, right? They're not actually thinking machines, right? It's a really excellent web crawler and amalgamator of information, right? Um, so I think one of the things I keep trying to tell my students, right, is like, okay, you can use AI, right? Like, but the thing about research and writing, in particular about writing, is that writing is a form of thinking, right? Like you don't come up with the thoughts fully formed in your head and then just reproduce them on the page, right? As you're writing, you're actually revising, rethinking, sharpening your argument. So if you're using AI, like, okay, I can't stop you, but you're not thinking, right? So, like, what are you getting out of any class in college if you're doing that? You're just punching the information in, right? But so, the fear I have, right, is it becomes a replacement for thinking, right? Becomes a replacement for people then rely on it to basically do not just basic thinking, like in terms of like how do you sharpen like computer code or how do you solve this like mathematical equation, but questions that don't have a yes or no answer, right? Questions that are interpretive, questions that are about balancing two sets of information in which there's not a clear answer, right? Because one of the things binary code can't do is it can't handle nuance and contradiction, right? Like,
Right.
so, but then the other thing is, I think we need to, as teachers, need to think about how we can use it as a tool to our advantage, right? Because I was talking to a friend of mine who was saying that she was sort of, she had done an observation of like how she had let her students use AI, right?
Yep.
Did an observation of how they used it, and they were using it almost like they were using it in what I think the original idea of it was as an assistant, right? Not as a replacement, but as an assistant, so that like they could test their arguments with it, right? And then it helped them see like where their weaknesses were. It could help them, fact check information, right? It could help them fix citations, right? Like, yes, students are cheating with it. Like, let's not deny it, but students were cheating before there was AI, and there'll be students cheating after there's AI, right? Um, but they were actually using it like as a sort of an aid, right? And I think if we can think about it as a way to help them sharpen their ideas, right? But also, I think what we really have to teach them about, right, is just sort of skepticism, right? Like, here's a tool, but it's still just a tool, right? It's not a deity that tells you the truth,
Right.
right? It's a tool, and any tool you need to be aware how you're using it, and you also have to be aware how the tool is using you, right? And so, um, yeah, I think there's it's an interesting moment. I think there's we're all worried about it, right? Let's not pretend we're not, right? But I think there's ways around it, or there's ways to harness it to our advantage, or to use it as a we love those words, teaching moment, right? Use it as a teaching. So it doesn't have to be our enemy. It's definitely made things a lot more complicated. I'll put it that way. But
Mm.
so I mean, I don't know what your experience with AI is, or
We have teachers that are scared of it. We have teachers
Mhm.
that don't think it's their role to help students learn it.
Right.
And some teachers are integrating it well. I mean, honestly, what we're doing in the business with AI and what we're trying to develop, because we're actually long term trying to develop an AI tutor that can assist. It's it's so disruptive. I mean, um, I know you've heard of ChatGPT. Have you heard of Claude?
Yes, and I hear much better things about Claude than I hear about ChatGPT.
Claude is amazing. I'm working with our social media person, trying to
Mm-hmm.
like create some new like web pages and stuff. And I literally took images of our new brand, like put it in the cloud, put Google Docs in the cloud, and like I need you to create web pages in our platform, Go High Level. And it did it like within 10 minutes. I had 5 web pages built. It was, and like that is unbelievable. She's like, I'm gonna lose my job. I'm like, no, I need you to like polish it. I'm like, no, this is just to save you time because we need to get stuff done. But yeah, it's super disruptive. It's but I do see it of like there's no verification of the information. It's an advanced language model, and so like we're not if we don't know those arts of critical thinking, we're just taking it for its worth, and we're just okay, we'll go with it. And it's like, no, this is actually false.
Right, and part of it is like people call them hallucinations, right? But it's not a
Mm,
hallucination. It's like it's only as good as the data set it's trained on, and as we
right.
all know on the internet, there's a lot of garbage. So
Mm,
and so it's that's why I've heard better things about Claude because they use a different approach, if I understand it correctly. I'm not a computer
yeah.
person, but they use a different
Well,
model than ChatGPT. So
yeah. I think the role, because I'm thinking like my dad was a lawyer. My dad's still a lawyer. And if you could train it and hook it up to the entire like legal knowledge of mankind, and it could search every legal decision ever made, every legal interpretation,
mhm.
and basically within seconds you could have a legal case and how to
I'd
even though it's
argue.
still yeah, even though it's still judged, right? Unless we replace that with a robot. But um I just think of like, well, what's the role of lawyer? What's the role of paralegals? What's the role of lawyers going to be? But you're still going to have to learn how to prompt it, right? It's not going
Right.
to.
And
It's
that's
still
the
there's
point one
still
of my friends
inputs.
has made, right? Is like it's you still have to learn how to ask the questions, right? And actually,
Mm-hmm.
when we teach our students, that's one of the things we always say to them, right? Is like one of the most important things is the questions you ask, not necessarily like that's maybe the hardest part is coming up with good questions. So
Do you think? I'm not going to say necessary college, but do you think K through 12 does a good job of teaching kids how to ask good questions? You can be
no,
honest. It's okay. Okay.
no, and it's not really the
I would
fault of
agree with you.
it's not really the fault of K through 12 teachers, I would say, because
You don't think?
well, I mean, it depends, but I mean, I don't. It has to do with incentives, right? Because so much of this has been replaced with like teach to the test, right? And
Well, yeah. But do you think the system of school,
no, no, I don't. Like I say, this, I wouldn't blame individual teachers. I would blame the system for
the
sure.
system, because like you're told it's divergent versus like convergent thinking.
Yes,
Like you're taught
that's
there's
right.
one way of thinking through it. There's only one way to do it. And then they're like, I know Neil deGrasse Tyson used to talk about like
Hmm.
toddlers of like experimenting, and like everything they hear from parents is no, don't do this, don't do this, don't do it. And so like toddlers naturally question the world by testing limits, and that's how we develop the curiosity. But like, do you think the system of education, and I mean system of like pre-K, this is all the way through, right? Of just how we are teaching society to conform. Do you think that, well, you kind of answered already, but like, we're really not allowing kids to generally be curious, like let curiosity drive
No,
question making.
absolutely not.
So,
I was lucky. My daughter she didn't go to Montessori, but she went to an Emilia Romagna program,
mm,
which it's one of those models that is based on student directed learning, right? And she's been lucky to do that. But like, I mean, I know her program is an exception. And then, when you enter into the usual sort of K through 12 system, like that level of experimentation is, it's rarer, right? Because, it's about the way in which curricula are structured. It's the incentive structure of like the teachers have to teach the test, right? And if they can't get their students across the test, then they lose their job, right? And then the simple fact that like you don't have the time and the resources to teach creative thinking, and I don't know how you solve that, but it is critical because I think as you say, like exploration, experimentation, imagination, these are all really important and are other they're components of intelligence that we don't consider to be intelligence, but they are intelligence, and they tend to lead more towards people who think critically and creatively about the world, and we need more of those kind of people. So,
Do you think schools kill creative thinking or critical thinking?
They can, for sure. I mean, I think any of us who have gone into education, right, will inevitably tell a story about some teacher who didn't do that, right? But it seems like it's those teachers don't seem like they're the norm. And again, I don't know why that's the case. I blame the overall system, but it's just tough, right? Like
Right.
teachers are paid garbage, like their schools are in terrible condition, like it's just it's difficult, right?
Well, we have both been tutoring our share number of AP history students. Does it still surprise you, like how many kids come in without the lens of even like how they're going to think critically through the writing, and like they apply almost all the wrong attributes, right? Because they're trying to like memorize themselves into the ground when like none of the test is memorization, and just like teaching a kid. That's what I said. Like we're getting products of kids that are coming through a broken system and they're not thinking for themselves at all, and they're like, I know this one way of studying. It's just to memorize the right answers, and you'll be good. And it's like, well, you get to the test, and you're kind of screwed if you do that. So like, you're
Absolutely.
like,
Yeah, on the history test, you're absolutely screwed if you do that, right? Because um, yeah, I mean, again, I think it's there's such variety, right? I've definitely gotten students who are very focused on the memorization, like it's content, 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 right, and not about skills, approach, methodology, and so on. And then I get students who clearly have been really well prepared by their AP teachers, right?
mhm.
They understand that that's what the test is about, or they're just one of those teachers who that's how they teach, right? And so I actually think maybe I would even say I've been pleasantly surprised, at least particularly this year, about how many of them are have some of those skills already in place, right? And so
Oh, that's
it's
good.
made it easier for me to build on because they've already got that there, and they understand that. And so I guess I would say kudos to their teachers because they've
That's
done a
good.
good job with them. So
Well, then we're expecting a lot of fives then, Dr. Haley. No pressure.
I hope so. I hope so.
Well,
I'm optimistic. So
so Miss Patty, who was one of our AP US tutors last year, she was a retired A push teacher, and she was also a reader like yourself. And she gave me the presentation that College Board, like that the readers got, and it just seemed like, I mean, it just seemed like there was a subtle message of ease up on the grading of the writing. At least that's what how I came across conveyed, because it provided like, we're not doing this because we're competing with dual enrollment or college and high school classes. We're doing this because their belief is that, I mean, but it's like, how do you can you not say that you're not? Because a kid could take a CHS US history class and get the guaranteed credit without taking the exam. Meanwhile, A push is still one. It was one of the hardest exams to pass, and kids are not walking away with credit when it's like they can get out of their intro US classes. So, do you have you got a sense for the world at least that the graders are easing up on what they're accepting as scored responses? And do you think that's a good thing?
I mean, I think you can see it in that they have changed the rubrics, right, for the DBQ, right? They've reduced the number of documents you need to use. They've eased up on that. I mean, although if you think about it, like the idea of doing one of those DBQs in an hour is absurd to me, um, because it's like, how can you read these documents and even begin to digest them, and then write an essay about them? So they've eased up on that a little bit, but um, yeah, there has been a bit of easing up. There's a bit more flexibility, I think, in terms of what qualifies, but if you don't have the stuff there that they want you to have, like you're out of luck, right? Like if you can't demonstrate that particular, a certain skill set in your answers, you're out of luck.
Right.
But there's certainly been a bit more flexibility in maybe what qualifies for those answers. And I'd say it's eased up a little, but it hasn't in the 7 years I've been doing it, which is, I started about when they changed the formats
20,
about
yeah.
7, 8 years ago, right? When they switched to the current basic format of SAQ, DBQ, LAQ. Um, it hasn't changed as dramatically as I thought it would. But there is definitely um, on the longer essays, there's a bit more flex, I think, than maybe there had been at the beginning. So,
are you going to Kansas City this year?
yeah, I am
But in
actually
person?
in Kansas City.
We're going to
Yep.
do a live stream from there inside College Board.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect. So,
Secret AP World Secrets.
yeah, exactly.
So okay, cool. Well, I guess like where do you see it all going in the next couple of years in terms of just thinking about higher ed, AP as a system? Like where do you see the biggest opportunities to potentially apply a system? Because we're very disjointed, right? We don't necessarily prepare kids holistically for the rigors of college and the career, but then I don't know if colleges do a holistic job because I'm sure they're very siloed in their own departments there as well. But like, where do you see education going as a system?
I mean, that is the $1 billion question, right? I don't know. I've been really, if you had asked me that question a year or two ago, I think I would have given you a very cynical answer. Um, in just that it feels to me like outside of the realm of like elite universities, like a lot of our universities are being sort of turned into glorified trade colleges, which is no knock on trade colleges, right?
Really?
Like that's not what the university was originally set up to be, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's you look at the declining number of majors in fields that are not, pre-professional, and it's and on one hand I understand that track, right? Like it's you know the competition for jobs has become such that like students can't luxuriate in stuff that doesn't help them, right? But
Right.
the problem is that this is then incentivizing administrations to then double down on that, right? Which this becomes like a vicious cycle. Like the non STEM fields get defunded, right? And then I'll just give you the examples. Like my building at the university is like should be knocked down and condemned, right? Because it doesn't really broadcast a great advertisement for history as a discipline that you're in this decrepit building that is itself should be consigned to the dustbin of history, right? Like, and
The
so I
science
worry about
building's
that.
probably good though, right?
But
The science building's probably good, right?
actually, the biology building should also be condemned. But
Really? Oh man.
the engineering just got a new building, so. But I guess I also feel like we might be reaching like a peak or we might be reaching a pivot point, right? Where people are starting to realize, like, so I heard this interview back in October with he is the career counselor at Carnegie Mellon in your city. And he was talking about how his students, right, who are coming out of Carnegie Mellon, right, which is like a STEM college, right,
Yeah.
having a hard time competing. Some of his students were having a hard time competing for jobs because they lacked soft skills, right? And then he recited what soft skills were, right? And I was listening to it, and I'm like, everything he just recited is what the humanities teaches, right?
Well, that's so funny because Fareed Zakari said that too, like in defense of a liberal education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's something Martha Nussbaum gets to in her book about that also. But I think maybe the future is, and this is where I think those of us in disciplines like history, and I look at one of my colleagues who kind of does this work, is thinking about how do we combine hard and soft skills together, right? Like how do we teach them, and we say soft skills, I shouldn't say that that's not it sounds judgmental, but it's not. It just means things like they're not like, it's things like writing, interpretation, argument, public speaking. They're not soft in the sense that they're
Like,
like,
yeah, no, we're
they're
struggling
actually
with that
arguably
too.
more difficult than hard skills.
Communication, human
Yeah.
skills, how to be a human.
How to be a human being, right? Like, but maybe how do we think about combining those, like where they can learn like, a set of skills that they can take with them into that first job, right? But then having the more complex and higher level critical skills that are going to see them into the future, right? Like what's going to get them that second and third and fourth job outside of college, right? And
Right.
that's where I think we have to start rethinking the university, because I don't think it's STEM versus humanities. It's about thinking about how the two can work together, right? Which is at the end of the day the ideal of the university, right? I just think
Universal
we've lost
education,
it in
right?
the last 30 years, right?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you having you. I hope this was good. We're still very early on in this, so be good to feature it. Do you have a copy? Do you have a cover of your book out there yet, or no?
I do. Yeah, I'll send it to you. How about that?
I will. We'll put it in.
Yeah,
Buy the book, right? We'll promo that.
yeah. I'll send
Um,
you the cover. So
all right, and we still need to meet up in Nashville for some hot chicken and
I
some beer
agree.
or something
I
for
agree
some
100%.
next time for sure.
Next
How
time,
far away are you from?
just 2 hours. It's not
Oh,
that
that's not
far at
bad.
all.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. So, all right, Dr. Daly, it's been a pleasure.
Yep, Joe. Good to
Keep
talk to
crushing
you.
with our students. Absolutely. Take care. Have
Absolutely.
a good
Have a
one.
good one.
You too.